Hello. I thought I'd talk about the EU referendum again today, but today I'm going to talk a bit about, I've got my notes here, a bit about the case against Brexit, because although I've been looking at the arguments, I've been kind of more persuaded by the Brexit arguments, and because to my mind the Remain people were not really making the case very well. And so I was not being persuaded. Now, I thought, well, I'd better have a proper look at the case, because we'd have to make a proper decision at the end of the day. Try and find some facts. Because a lot of people are telling a lot of lies, actually. And there are things which are being said and repeated which are wrong. And, sorry, but they need to be fixed. For example, on the Remain side, the Treasury or George Osborne has been saying that British families will be £4,300 a year worse off in 10 years' time if we leave the EU. Well, he has been told off this week by the Parliamentary Select Treasury Committee for saying this when it's patently misleading. The Treasury cannot forecast that far ahead. It's nonsense, in other words. And it's based on assumptions which are not made explicit and which are probably false. Similarly, the Brexit people go on about this £385 billion a year nonsense. Everybody knows we get refunds and a lot of it comes back. Our EU budget is at about 76 billion, in fact, and it's 1% of our GDP. It's actually a tiny amount. Okay, so these kinds of falsehoods, when the people have been told that they are wrong or misleading and carry on repeating them, that makes them liars, to me. So both sides are liars. Isn't that helpful for us when we're trying to make a decision? So anyway, I want to look at the Remain arguments a bit more in depth and just see if they are sensible or not. And also, of course, some of the Brexit arguments will have bearing on this. So certainly one of the common complaints is that the EU is corrupt and their accounts have not been signed off since the 80s or something. Well, you can look on the EU's website and it tells you it's not true. It's actually been reported in the newspapers, again, still, that their accounts which haven't been signed off since 19 whatever it was. I think it was in the Times. Wrong. They have been. Okay. The accounts are being signed off. They don't, I think, do double entry bookkeeping, and some of the MP's expenditure is not accountable. But on their spending, the government spending, as in the EU government spending, that is accounted for. It's not perfect, however. They have a 4% error rate, which mostly comes from the national governments which are part of the EU. Their errors adding up. But to say the accounts haven't been signed off is a true and fair representation of spending is false. And you can check it on the EU's own websites. They've got a myth debunking page. Let me make a note. I should put a link to it. Link. Yep. And I should link to some of the other things. As I remember, I'll make down my notes, because I just thought I'd better start, or I'll go on researching this forever. Now, one of the big complaints about the EU is that a lot of migrants are coming over here and claiming benefits. There's some truth to that, as far as I can make out. But there are two different types of benefits that are worth considering. There's out-of-work benefits and there's in-work benefits, and the treatment is slightly different. David Cameron has acquired a temporary opt-out for giving EU workers in-work benefits, that is working tax credit primarily, some housing benefit. That expires in 7 years' time anyway, and if they've worked here for 4 years they will get the full benefits anyway. So it's not much of a difference. At present, working tax credit payments to the migrants represents 1.6% of working tax credit bill. It's not a lot, again. Let me put a link to that. Okay. For out-of-work benefits, as I understand the way it works, that's unemployment benefit, or job seekers allowance as they euphemistically call it now, and housing benefit primarily. Those are out of work. When you're out of work, you can get that. They don't get any for 3 months anyway, I believe, for the first 3 months. Then they're only allowed to claim it for 3 months. And they can only continue to claim it if there is a genuine prospect of them finding a job in the very near future. That is being interpreted, as far as I can make out, quite strictly. In that if they don't have an actual job offer, they're not going to get it. Right? It may be they're starting in a week's time or something, so they can claim it for another week. It's that kind of thing. So if they don't basically find a job within 3 months of starting to claim, their claim is cut off in most cases. And they don't even get housing benefits. They won't be able to pay rent. And so they either live with friends or camp on the streets or go home to some other country, if they can afford to leave the country. Presumably they will be able to. Borrow from parents or something, I suppose. So the idea of people receiving benefits is not actually... It's more hot air than it is substance. At least that's the way it seems to me. It's quite strict already. And the case for workers from the EU is of course different from the case for refugees. We have lots of those from all over the world, and at various times in our history have come here, including recent history. So they do get benefits. They're not covered by the same rules. And just to have an idea of the numbers of migrants in this country at the moment, the top 10 from around the world, the numbers of people in Britain, this is based on figures for 2012. I don't have more recent figures, so some of them will be a bit off. It's hard to know, obviously. Indian, 729,000. Polish, 646,000. That number is probably declining now because it's quite clear that they're heading back home on the whole. They've made their money over here and they're going back and building their own houses and what have you back home. Pakistan, 465,000. Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, 403,000. Germany, 304,000. Bangladesh, 234,000. US citizens, there's 217,000 in Britain. South Africans, 209,000. Nigerians, 180,000. And Jamaicans, 145,000. So only 1, 2, 3 EU countries come in the top 10 anyway in terms of migrants in this country. Okay, if we just look at the EU, the top 10 EU countries migrants in this country is Poland, 646,000 as I said, Ireland 403, Germany 304,000, France 136,000. Apparently London is one of France's biggest cities. Anyway, Italy 133,000. Lithuania 130,000, Romanians 101,000, Portuguese 90,000, Spanish 83,000, and Latvia 69,000 as of 2012. These numbers have obviously changed a bit, but they're probably of the same rough order. Now, certainly we don't get any complaints about French and Germans and Italians over here causing trouble. You do hear some problems about Romanian criminals and stuff. Apparently, according to one of my commenters, it's all gone down in Romania since they joined the EU. So what can I say? One other thing to mention, I think, about the EU that's worth saying, actually, is that certain segments of the British media are anti-EU. So Rupert Murdoch's newspapers, the Times Group, is it the Daily Mail, the Sun, I can't remember which of his papers, I don't read this trash, but they are against the EU. And to me that's a big warning flag. If he's against the EU, should we be against the EU? Because his papers are the, how can I put it? It's like they're drawn up in the gutter somewhere, really. I mean, he does have the classy old Times, but it still promotes his business preferences. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He does influence governments and meet with prime ministers and presidents and the rest to push his very right-wing agenda. It's very easy for him to talk about benefit scroungers and things like that, which he does. When he's a billionaire, the 33rd richest person in the world, probably, roughly, as the figure I saw last anyway. He's very rich, right? So it's easy for him to talk about benefit scroungers, and I think he doesn't know what he's talking about, probably. And this is unfortunately the way with a lot of very influential people. They've no idea really what it's like to live without money. I too tend to be more right-wing than left these days, but I don't go as far as him. I'm much more liberal, if you like, than him. So if the Murdoch media are against the European Union, that can only be because they feel the EU is contrary to their business interests, because it will regulate their industries and maybe force them to stop telling lies eventually. Wouldn't that be good? Right, EU trade. Another big issue is EU trade. A lot of people are saying, look, we can come out of the EU, we can trade with the Commonwealth, we can make trade deals with big countries elsewhere in the world, India, China. We can't do that at the moment, right? Switzerland has made $44 trillion worth of deals with countries around the world in the time that we've done nothing within the EU. Are they right? Well, they might be, of course. But consider the size of the single market. It's 500 million people, okay? And its financial size is what counts. You compare that with, say, the British Commonwealth, or so-called, it's the Commonwealth now without the British bit because we're politically correct over here. Our once upon a time British Commonwealth currently consists of 53 countries. Most of them are underdeveloped. Okay. The complete size of the rest of the Commonwealth represents 1/5 of the single market. Those 53 countries add up in financial size to 1/5 of the EU. I got that figure from a speech by John Major. Another one. Brazil, Russia, India and China together add up to 1/6 of the EU. Could we really pull out of a massive, massive market and join up with these tiddlers and get anywhere? Really? Now, you could argue that actually we wouldn't leave, we would still trade with the EU. Yeah. Maybe we would. Suppose we do. It would get more difficult. Maybe we'd lose 5 or 10% of our trade with the EU, say, certainly at first, and over time maybe improve it. To pick up that 5 or 10% from, say, the Commonwealth, we would have to be doing 50% of their trade with us. It would have to be massive from their point of view. Same with Brazil, Russia, India, China. We would have to be trading with them on their terms, on the scale of, from their point of view, it would have to be massive trade with Britain to take up that slack, because they are so tiny. To make up what we'd lost in the EU, we would have to be grabbing all of that and more. Well, we'd have to grab half of it, say. That would be quite something to do quickly. Why not stay in the EU and get the EU to negotiate with these people over time, and we can do it that way. Surely it's not impossible. The EU is a bit crap at negotiating, we know, because they have 28 countries, and any one of them can veto this or that, or complain about these terms. It makes it very tough. But when they do get a deal, it should be really good. Slow, but steady wins the race. What do you think? I don't know. China obviously is not a tiddler in the long run, but that could take a century or more. Okay. Right now, the trade with Britain is negligible in comparison with that with the EU. We sell them a bit of Lipton's tea or something, right? Well, okay. So I think that's very important. And also think about it from the point of view of foreign investment in the UK. If you were the boss of some big foreign company and you were thinking about where to invest to make the most profit for your advantage, and you have a choice of two places. You could invest in an independent Britain with its population of 65 million people and some sort of trading arrangement with the EU. Or you could invest in the EU with 500 million people. Surely it's a no-brainer. What would be the point of coming to Britain rather than the EU? Language? Well, you can learn a language, right? If not, you can hire someone who does. I can't see the advantage of, as a foreign investor, if I were one, why would I invest in Britain rather than the EU? What would be the purpose of it? It's a small market. It's kind of big-ish on the world stage, yes, but it does not compare with the EU, which is much bigger. Now, I think I mentioned earlier that our payouts to the EU are about 1% of our GDP, so that was to do with the Brexit lies. And a lot of people say that our Parliament is busy passing, 68% of its laws are passed because of the EU now. Well, I saw a link to Hansard which indicated, I forget, I'll have to put a link. I'll put the link in. It was 2 or 3 years ago. Out of 122 laws passed, 4 were from the EU. Not 68%, more like 3%. So, what are they talking about? I'll stick the link. If I can find it again, I hope I can. We'll lose our national character if we stay in the EU. We've been in the EU for 40 years. Have we lost it already? How much of it has gone? 100% of it? 5% of it? The French, they still eat onions. They like cheese. The Italians are still all Mamma Mia. What's changed? Nothing. Our national character hasn't changed. We're a bit more politically correct. I think you can blame the Labour Party for that, not the EU. Stop kowtowing to fascists and you won't have to be politically correct. Right. Now, there's talk that Britain is losing its sovereignty to the EU. Strictly speaking, that's false, because all Parliament has to do, and it can do it at any time, is repeal the Single European Act. If they do that, we are out. And Parliament retains sovereignty, in fact. There are treaties saying we must negotiate and do this, but we don't totally have to. If the EU was a binding organisation, we wouldn't be having this referendum now either. So there is a real risk of Brexit, apparently. I know some people claim that it's going to be rigged. There are always people who claim this sort of thing. Okay, people fear the worst, but it's not practical, really. Let's talk about our votes on the European Council, how we're on the wrong side, we've never got anything through. It's not true, we're on the winning side of votes more than 90% of the time. We've been overruled a few times too, many times, because some of the votes are by majority and some are by consensus and some are by absolute 100% requirement. I'll talk about that in a minute, how the EU constitution works. But it's not true that we're always overruled. We're often on the winning side. It's often our proposals that are accepted. It's a democracy of sorts, and I'll discuss that. People complain about the European Court of Human Rights. This is not an EU institution. It was set up by the British, okay, in Europe. Hey, guess what? It's our own fault. Hard luck. It's not to do with the EU. Forget it. Immigration. I've talked about benefits and I've talked about the numbers of people here. At the moment, the EU is taking in something like 300,000 immigrants. Or rather, Britain is taking in perhaps maybe 300,000 immigrants per annum, which is very high. But if you look at it strategically from the overall big picture point of view, this is probably a temporary thing, because there are two crises going on in Europe. There's the Middle Eastern refugee crisis, and there is the Euro crisis, caused by too many countries joining the Euro when they shouldn't have, prior to the crash in 2008. So people are coming here to work. The vast majority of jobs in Europe are being created in London, with some in the Ruhr, some in the Netherlands, places like that. So of course people are coming here, and the place can accommodate these people, amazingly. We're getting problems with property prices, so much so, but as with the Polish starting to return now back to Poland, probably we will find that a good number of these people, most of them even in the long run, will probably want to head back, ultimately. They've come here for work, they haven't really come here because London is such a fantastic place. It is, but let's face it, if you come from Southern Europe, okay, with the Mediterranean and the sunshine and the Alps, and you come to London and the grime the pollution, the rain. Is it really, really going to be your home from home? Come on. London is a fantastic, fantastic city. But the climate, the environment, it could be, it's not, it's not Rome, It does have lots of visitors though. I read the other day that the British Museum alone has more visitors every year than Belgium does. It's incredible. Right, So the current wave of immigration, or temporary immigration, is happening because of the unemployment crisis primarily in Southern Europe and the Middle Eastern crisis, which we've blown up ourselves, let's face it. We will vote for these warmongering twerps, and so we get the chaos that follows. Now, people talk about how the EU is trying to enlarge and getting beyond its station. One of the examples given is how the EU interfered in the Ukraine and stirred up Putin. And I agree. They were trying to get Ukraine to join NATO and the EU. And Putin, of course, didn't want that. That's part of his sphere of influence. And in fact, back in the days of the Soviet Empire, really, most of their productivity, their industrial production, the highest concentration of it is the Ukraine. It is Russia's industrial heartland. Of course they don't want to give it up. But that wasn't the EU as such. It was the EU, but they interfered in the Ukraine based on a proposal put forward by Britain and Germany. So it's our fault again. Our own stupid leaders, who we elect, are the ones who are doing these things. It's not the EU's fault, I think. If our leaders put forward such proposals, we need to keep our leaders accountable for them and not blame the EU, which is just a red herring. Okay. Now, people do say, nevertheless, that the EU is run by unelected bureaucrats. And I want to discuss the EU's constitution a bit, because when you look at it, it's actually not undemocratic, if you accept that our own countries are democratic. So in Britain, for example, we have a Queen who is not elected, and we have a House of Lords that is not elected. The Queen is kind of like a president in other systems, except she can't propose legislation. She can advise ministers, and I don't know really what she does, frankly, but they go and see her every week or so. It's a bit worrying, really, that this person who's nothing to do with anything is in charge. It's very strange, but it works. The system seems to be working. We have an elected parliament, the House of Commons, and the government, which is ministers chosen from the House of Commons to be heads of portfolios like finance and health and so on, and the Prime Minister and so on, and the Chancellor, etc., etc., right? So it's kind of similar to other systems with variations. In America they have a Senate and a Congress and a President. The EU has a European Council, a Council of the EU, which is different, a Parliament, and a Commission. The Commission is the civil service. People complain about the Commission being not democratic. You don't elect your civil service. Okay. That's why. Parliament, in fact, appoints the head of the civil service anyway. The EU Parliament. So, let's have a look. We know about our Parliament. in the EU. We elect our MEPs. They go. Britain has, I think, 74. Germany has 76. France has 74 as well, something like that. We have 73, perhaps. Italy has 72, something of that sort. Other countries, Luxembourg has about 6. They all have MEPs proportional roughly to their population. And they can amend legislation, they can adopt legislation, they can agree to the EU budget which the Commission puts forward. But so we know roughly what a parliament is. They're all roughly the same, especially nowadays. The EU one has been expanded; its powers have been expanded recently in the Lisbon Treaty. But the EU as a whole, how is it run? It is run from the top by the European Council, also known as the EU Council. That is a committee of the heads of government of the 28 nations. That means that our representative on the EU Council is David Cameron. That council is in charge. They are the government of the EU, in the equivalent, if you like, of the cabinet in Britain, or the equivalent kind of the president in the United States. Although there is an EU president, he's on that committee too. Each country, we have a rotating presidency. It's kind of ceremonial. I don't think he has any particular power. He chairs the meetings and things of that sort. So what they do is define the European Union's policies, basically. They provide policy directives, and they send those to the Commission, the civil service, which draws up the bills, makes the laws. It writes out the laws, proposes them. Okay. Then both the Council and the Parliament can take what the Commission proposes, they can amend them, they can adopt them, they can reject them, obviously, and they can sort out the budgets. Okay, they do an overall budget for the EU. It's still managed by the civil service there, like it is in this country. When laws are passed, the civil service has to implement them and find employees to do these jobs, and departments set them up, and so on. The government doesn't do it, it just says, okay, here's what you're going to do, off you go. It's the same in the EU. Okay. That's the European Council. There's this other thing called the Council of the EU. There's another thing called the Council of Europe as well, which is not part of the EU. Don't worry about them. Okay. The Council of the EU has a changing membership because it depends on what they're meeting about. They are very much like the cabinet in the British system. They are the ministers of portfolio. So if they are going to have a meeting about the budget or finances, then the finance ministers of the various EU countries will meet and decide upon it. And they have the power to commit their countries to whatever they agree to. So they can agree to laws which the Commission puts forward jointly with the Parliament. They can amend them and adopt them. They can develop foreign and security policy for the EU, and again the Commission has to implement it somehow. They can conclude international agreements between the EU and other countries and organisations. Anything which a minister can do in a country, this council can do in Europe, collectively, with a group of ministers. For some things like foreign policy and taxes, they must agree unanimously. But for most issues, it's done on a majority vote. 65% of the votes must represent 55% of the countries in the EU and 65% of the population, so that you can't have a whole load of small countries ganging up and getting more votes, 55% of the countries. So you have to have those two factors together before something is carried. That's quite democratic. It's quite logical and sensible when you think about it. How else could you do it that it would be fair? So it's kind of a qualified majority for most things. And there's one other thing which is in the EU. Maybe you didn't know. It's the Citizens' Initiative. Have you heard of that? Now I've said that Parliament approves laws and so on. They can't actually propose laws as such themselves. Neither as such can the European Council, even though it's in charge. What they can do is ask, that is demand, that the Commission writes a law. They can propose legislation in the sense that they can ask the Commission to write a law about this or that policy. So they want a law about something, they can formally ask the Commission to do it, and the Commission will come up with the law, and then they vote on it. Okay. But citizens can do that too in the EU. The way it works is you collect 1 million signatures, and then you can propose that law to the Commission, and the Commission has to draw it up, and then the Parliament and the Council will vote on it. So that's pretty democratic. 1 million signatures is maybe not easy to get, obviously, but we have a 500 million population, so it's only 1 in 500 people. Any reasonably popular measure is going to get signatures. We have a similar thing in the UK. If you collect 100,000 signatures on the government's website, there's a issues website, I forget what it's called, then Parliament has to discuss it. They don't have to do anything more, they just have to talk about it. You can raise the issue in Parliament. Well, it's something. The EU one is more democratic. You can actually propose the law, get the Commission to write a law about it with 1 million signatures. That is democratic, I think. It's similar to the Swiss system, actually. They have to get something like, I think it's 100,000 signatures now, I can't remember, it's something of that order. And their government has to implement whatever it is. That's a bit stricter in Switzerland, they have to do it. Here, the law has to be written, but then it can be voted down. But still, that's making your opinion known in a big way. Now, have I missed anything out? That's the things I think I wanted to talk about. Overall, it makes it really rather hard to decide because there are arguments on both sides. But having found that the EU is nowhere near as bad as people are painting it, or maybe I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong then in the comments. Maybe I should vote to stay in. What do you think? I don't know. Bye for now.